When I got my first job as a software engineer, I had no experience in their tech stack at all. I'd never written a line of C# or XAML. I didn't even know what XAML was. And then 3 months later, I was contributing to the sprint as a junior developer. In this video, I'll give you a realistic timeline of what can be achieved and actionable steps that anyone can take, whether you have a job or not, to get you sprint ready. So there are advantages to learning on the job. The first one being the quantity of work that you do. So there was a guarantee that when I showed up, I was going to do 8 hours of work. Now, if you extrapolate this across 3 months, 5 days, I did 120 hours of work to go from not knowing any C# and XAML to writing and solving problems in it. So we won't talk in months here because I completely understand that most people don't have the opportunity to just spend 8 hours a day. Now, that being said, when I was learning Python to automate my first job, I would work from 7 in the morning, I wouldn't get home until 7 in the evening, I'd make a quick dinner, and then I'd work until basically I fell asleep writing Python. So depending on how motivated you are, depends on how quickly you can get this done. But I think 120 hours is a pretty nice metric to use for divvying up the work that you're going to do, because that's one of the more important parts that we'll get into in a bit. But another advantage that people who work have is immediate help. So when I was learning, I was surrounded by people who were seasoned software engineers, and if I had a problem, I could just sigh, turn to the person next to me, and hope that they weren't too involved in what they were doing so they could lend me a hand. And typically there was always somebody. Those are the kinds of companies that you want to work for, where collaboration is encouraged. I mean, we have one senior who, no matter how busy they are, will immediately drop what they're doing to come and help you. And that has had the single biggest impact on my career of any of the things that I'm going to go into. But until you get that first job, you won't experience those benefits. And lastly, you're managed. So the problem with self-learning is that you don't have somebody checking to make sure that the work is actually getting done. And typically there aren't consequences to falling behind, because the only person driving your work is you, which, unless you're David Goggins or something, the chances are you're going to slip into bad habits and you're not going to be able to stick to whatever time frame that you set. But that doesn't matter so much, because fundamentally, if the 120 hours takes 4 months instead of 3 months, at the end of it, you're still going to be in a position where the chances are you can start going to interview. Okay, so how do we get around the fact that we might not have these advantages? Well, of those 120 hours that I was talking about, it's how you divide that time that's important. I think a lot of people, when they're trying to get into a coding bootcamp, they'll spend countless hours just watching tutorials on YouTube of how to code. And don't get me wrong, you do need to do that, because if you don't understand the language at all, then you're not going to be able to sit down, look at some code and start working, right? Or you're not going to be able to pick a problem and solve it. So the way that it worked for me is mine was split into theory work, so time spent actually just, say, on Pluralsight, Codecademy, YouTube tutorials, that kind of thing. Writing a project from scratch, so something completely new, so that you have to build from the ground up, and then working with existing code, whether it was expanding to new features or also finding known problems in the code and solving them. Now, how was this split up? And I think this might shock quite a few people. Of the 3 months that I had, 8% of my time was spent doing theory. Literally just the first week, all we did is we sat down and we went over the business knowledge required and also the fundamentals of C# and XAML. 16% was spent doing a project from the ground up. So that was, okay, here's something very, very basic. Let's see if we can build it from the ground up and then expand on it. Which leaves over 76% of my time was spent actually in the code base, looking for bugs, trying to expand existing features with a lot of hand-holding and explaining. So actually, when it comes down to it, a quarter of my time was spent doing, I feel like, what most code academies build you up to do, where you find a boot camp and you'll learn the theory, build a project so that you have a portfolio. But fundamentally, 75% of the work was existing code. And if you go into the industry as a junior, chances are you're not doing greenfield projects. Instead, you'll be taking the existing system and either expanding it, or you get a response from a customer or a client and you have to go and find the solution as to why the thing that isn't working for them isn't working. So what I would do if I were you is, let's clock this out in hours. For the theory, you've got 10 hours. So pick a course that's well known for your language or tech stack of choice. So probably your best shot is to go on something like Pluralsight, just because Sure, it's going to set you back 30 quid, but you know that you're going to get value for your time, and you're not going to waste 50 hours trying to learn the basics. They're going to have a 10-hour course that will probably take you from knowing nothing to ready to start writing code. Then spend 20 hours picking a project that you would genuinely be interested in that isn't gigantic in scope. So you want something that you can actually get done, preferably in 10 hours, because you're going to spend another 10 hours just fiddling around trying to get it to work, right? So keep it simple. I actually have another video that I'll link at the end that walks you through an idea for a very basic personal project for people who are getting started. But really, a to-do list, a calculator, a very simple game of Pong, something like that. But now here's where you want to spend the bulk of your time dealing with existing code. Now, if you're not in a company, you might be wondering, well, how do I do that? Because I'm not in a code base. There's nobody who's set me up. And that's a fair point. And I had to look through quite a few online tools, and there doesn't seem to be a very good solution to this. So what I'd actually recommend is if you type in open source projects in the language of your choice, you'll quite quickly find that they're available to download. And what you'll be able to do with these is open them up and just have a look around the code. Try and get to grips with it, because realistically, when you get a job, this is what you'll be doing. You'll be given a completely new existing program and told, okay, we have a new feature, or there's a problem somewhere within the code that's gone wrong. So once you get a feeling for how the code is written, because even if you learn best practice, the chances are that some of the places that you go to will have their own best practices that are different to what you've just learned on Pluralsight. So go and download one of these and then work out, okay, calculator, how can I add a feature? I noticed that this doesn't have a log button or an exponential button. Add that as a feature. Now, what that's going to get you doing is actually being able to go into a completely new project blind and be able to deal with problems and solve them. And that fundamentally is how you'll spend most of your time as a software engineer. So this is the skill that you want to improve. You don't want to be completely building new projects from the start, because realistically, new projects go through a lot of business decisions before they actually come to a programmer. You're given a very narrow goal, and then you achieve it through your best practice. So find these games and think of features that would be reasonable to add. I'm not talking about completely rewriting the game, but maybe rock, paper, scissors. Add a fourth option. Hangman. Add a timer so that if you don't complete it in a certain amount of time, you fail the game. Calculator. Add a button that doesn't exist. Snakes and ladders. Add a separate tile that if you hit it, there's some custom logic. Now, I wouldn't just pick one project here and stick with it. I would try and add maybe a couple of features to each project and then just move on. Because what we're doing here is we're building that skill. I mean, some companies that you'll work for may have multiple different projects that are written slightly differently with different coding standards, because they were written at different times where maybe you've got a legacy project that wasn't written to the same standards that your current projects are written. So it's actually quite unfamiliar. So these kinds of skills will be invaluable. And this isn't to say that you can't add these to these portfolios. Of course you can. You can say, increase features on open source projects. And what that shows to your employer immediately is that you haven't just been working in an isolated bubble. You've been working with other people's code. Now, what you can do with this is that when you add a feature, try and do this within source control and pretend like you're actually working as a software engineer. So say we're doing Hangman and we're going to add a timer. Write this up as an actual work item, maybe as a story. Let's add a timer to Hangman, and that would be split into tasks. So I'll give you an example of why I've split this up like this. So if we're adding a timer to Hangman, we're introducing timer logic, we're creating the on-screen timer itself, and then we're linking the two together. Now, you might ask me, well, why don't we just do this all in one? Well, as a team, tasks can sometimes be split up so that people can work on things in parallel, and then there'll be a task that just connects the two together. If you can start splitting up problems, imagining that you're working as part of a team, think, okay, how can we break this down so multiple people could be working on it at the same time? The tasks that you do will be more relevant to what you'd actually see in the workplace. Now, these are very simple, and what you would get in a real work scenario would be far better thought out, but I'm just trying to illustrate the point here. And what you would do is you would use source control to track your changes. Right, so let's say that you have some nicely organized commit messages between each of the tasks. Now what we're doing is we're going to look for feedback, because that's how you're going to improve over time. So Probably the most cost-effective way of doing this is to just copy-paste your changes into ChatGPT and ask for feedback. This is quite a new way of learning, but what's going to be special about it is it's going to be personalized to your bespoke situation. Now, it's not going to be perfect because ChatGPT is prone to making mistakes, but this is going to be by far the cheapest and easiest entry-level feedback so that you can start reflecting on your work and improving upon it. The second thing you can do is join a community of other people who are learning. Now, I know that a lot of the online learning courses typically will have you join like a Discord group. There's no reason why you couldn't find somebody in these groups where you say, hey, why don't we have a look at each other's code changes and give each other feedback based on what we've learned. You probably want to find somebody who's doing the same language as you and is around the same level as you. And trust me, there are a lot of people trying to go from beginner to their first job, so that shouldn't be too hard to do. One of the best things that you could do is find a mentor. Now, online, if you go on Fiverr, you can probably find plenty of software engineers who are writing production level code who you can pay a fee to look over your work. If you look at a link in the description, I actually offer one-to-ones myself that go beyond just the scope of getting to your first job, but career progression in general and how to optimize your time. But whichever of these three work for you, you need some kind of feedback so that over time, you're not just learning bad habits and ingraining them, you're getting closer and closer to production level code. So what do you get out of this whole system? Well, first of all, your interview questions are kind of going to be covered, right? Because fundamentally, what you're going to be asked is these three things. Do you understand your theory? Do you have a portfolio with anything interesting on it? And, okay, how confident are you in finding and solving problems? And this is examples of finding and solving problems. Oh, there was X app, I thought that it could do with Y feature, so I implemented it. Here was my process. I started by writing an overarching idea, which I then split up into tasks and executed discreetly, and I tracked my changes in source control. Those are the types of things that they want to hear because it shows that you're not a complete beginner. You've been working in the context of how real software engineers work. Secondly, like I said, both of these are contributing to your portfolio. Here's some things that I've written from scratch. Here are some places where I've actually gone into code that wasn't written by me, and I've made myself familiar with it and added features. And also, I think what this sets you up for primarily is that when you sit down and you get that first task put on your desk, you've already got a workflow for getting started. You've done this before. You're not going to scramble and say, oh, I've never looked at somebody else's code before. I'm not familiar with this, because you've been doing it. And I think that if you spend these 120 hours, that's going to put you in a very strong position for starting your first job. And like I said, if you'd like a personal project, if you click on this video just here, I give you a pretty novel idea for how you can get started that I think is quite exciting because you'd be able to tie it in with your interest. And like I said, if you want one-to-one coaching, you can find a link in the description. I hope this helps.